Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our series called The Game of Creation. It's a study of Genesis 1 through 11, and are we ever going to get to chapter 11? Well, we actually get to it today, so just a little bit of a review, and then we'll just get into this meaty, juicy topic of temptation. Is that what we've been doing is starting last week, we're looking at Jay's story of creation. And Jay is the initial that is used to describe the writer called the Yahwist. So this is a part of Genesis that was written by or attributed to we're just going to call him Jay. And he's writing in the 9th century BC, writing at the time of Solomon and the height of Solomon's empire of Israel. And Jay is concerned about what he sees going on with Solomon's empire, especially with the fact that Solomon has married many foreign wives, and it's not so much that he has lots of wives as it is that they have brought in their own religions into the life and culture of Israel. And Solomon seems to have kind of gone along with their desires to worship their own gods, and has actually built temples and places of worship around Jerusalem for his foreign wives to worship. And these are gods like Baal and Ashtaroth and Astartes and other gods. And Jay is very, very concerned that Solomon has gone after these other gods, and therefore all of Israel therefore will fall into idolatry, because it's always been an issue. It's always been a temptation. And so Jay's way of dealing with that is to write this story of creation about the way things could have been or should have been, and his story of how he sees creation as a pushback towards this idea that Baal and Ashtaroth are okay, if you will, to worship. In fact, that only God, only Yahweh, is worthy of worship. How many were in the 8:45 service? Okay, you heard the word barren and fertility in that service. Those of you in the 11 o'clock service will hear that again. And it turns out that fertility was a big concern of Jay's, and that what he was concerned about in going after Israel, going after these other gods, is that Baal and Ashtaroth were gods of fertility, and that they were looking to these gods for fertility, if you will. And Jay's answer to that is no, only Yahweh brings fertility. And his story of temptation then pictures that. But the other theme that seems to be going on here is that the Yahwist, Jay, is very, very suspicious of progress, of civilization. And so a lot of the temptations that we see being written about in his story of creation deal with his concerns about progress, and we'll see how that goes. And it actually creates an interesting dilemma for us to consider, we who live in a very urban and advanced culture. But one of the things that I just wanted to kind of reiterate is that we are talking about myth, a form of writing, a genre that is called myth. Not myth in the sense that it's false or untrue, but myth in the sense that it is a way of telling profound truths about the nature of the world and the nature of God and the nature of our relationship with God. And so I just remind us by this quote from a book that I've drawn upon quite a bit, The Meaning of Creation by Conrad Hyers. One of the functions of a myth is to define and establish relationships, providing a rationale for a particular order of things. By means of a story, the myth describes the characteristics and interrelationships of things. A myth is not operating within the context of what a secular science might recognize as natural cause and effect, or historiography described as a temporal sequence of events. Myth has its own unique narrative character. And as long as we keep that in mind, we'll be kind of okay. When we start applying scientific or historical kinds of categories to Jay's story, where it'll kind of, it probably will mess us up. One of the ways that this is myth is the fact that God is anthropomorphized. I always like to say that. In this story, we have God walking with Adam and Eve in the garden, and there's lots of ways that these kinds of things take place. Of course, this is part of a larger painting where it's interesting that the artist has all kinds of events regarding Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in this one picture, and I forgot who the artist is. But this is that place where the ideal has been created, God walking with Adam and Eve in the garden, that they can enjoy, and that they just can enjoy the fruits of the garden without even having to work it. However, the Yahwist, or Jay, is very concerned about where this goes following with what temptation leads us to. And in the 11th chapter, there's this phrase where God is looking down on the Tower of Babel, and God says, this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And so there is this idea in Jay's writing that if you follow this path of worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth and looking to them for fertility, and if you proceed with knowledge and power and progress and civilization even, God is not going to be happy with you, and stuff happens. So these are sort of some of Jay's concerns. Jay is concerned about the temptation to knowledge and power. He's concerned that the desire to acquire knowledge and power is a dangerous thing. Greed and indulgence kind of results from that kind of thing. And so he's concerned about that temptation. He's concerned about the temptation to pride and pretension. There we go. And so people who aspire to become like God, or to have dominion over the earth, or to build great cities with temples reaching to the heavens to make a name for themselves. These are actually Jay's concerns about where humanity is going, or has gone, as he's writing the story of creation. And so throughout his story, these concerns keep popping up. For instance, we have the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, the murder of the first shepherd, Abel, by the first city dweller, Cain, the rise of metallurgy and technology in the Cain line, not in Seth's line. Seth, Abel, an untimely demise, and then Adam and Eve have Seth, and Seth is the godly line. That's in as the story proceeds, and then there's the Cain line, and in the Cain line there seems to be this concentration on developing civilization, metallurgy, and technology. They talk about Nimrod, a great warrior, and digging in the earth and all this kind of stuff. We have then the corruption of early civilizations and their destruction in a great flood. And then we have Noah's drunkenness. He planted a vineyard, agricultural kind of thing. and he gets drunk, and it brings shame to his family and everybody. You remember, his children cover him up. And it's because he was agricultural that becomes part of the issue. And then the cursing of Canaan, that becomes a key point in that the Canaanites are the people that the Israelites are actually contending with. Now let me just do a little caveat here. These today are going to be my only references to the flood today. We're going to kind of skip over chapters 6 through 9 today, because we're going to delve into them in great detail next Sunday. And we're going to actually, next Sunday, we're going to actually talk about the incredible and entertaining ways that people in the 1700s and 1800s tried to explain the flood in a scientific way. And so I encourage you to come back to just, we'll have fun talking how people in those centuries tried to figure out how the flood fit into the new science that was developing in the world. But needless to say, the destruction of the whole world by a flood was something that was not a good thing. And of course, then we have the judgment at Shinar. That's actually the place where the Tower of Babel is supposed to have been built. And then later on, we have Lot's rescue from the corrupt cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But notice that they're cities. And of course, in that story, it's Lot who decides to go live by and in the city, and Abraham decides not to. And so there's this distinction between Abraham, the shepherd, nomadic shepherd, Lot going to live in the city. So these are some of the kind of storylines, the temptation of things that fall apart because people have followed these kinds of pursuits. And then there's this Jay's emphasis on a pastoral and nomadic kind of emphasis. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are nomadic shepherds. Unfortunately, their descendants are put into forced labor and have to build palaces and treasure houses for the Pharaoh. And Moses, in fleeing Egypt, goes and tends sheep. And then, of course, the children of Israel wandering in the desert as tent dwellers and herders. And then even the promised land is described in pastoral terms as a land flowing with milk and honey. So there are these pastoral, nomadic kinds of idyllic kinds of things that come through the story. So Jay is as he writes this story of creation and then temptation, is one, making sure that people understand that it is God alone who brings fertility, not the Canaanite gods, and that this desire for Israel to be civilized and to be like all the other nations, which is one of the things that Samuel and God's dialogue with each other when the nation said they wanted to have a king, and Samuel said, "Oh, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that." And part of the idea is that Israel wanted to be like all the other nations, and God says that that's going to be to their demise. So there's that theme continuing out along throughout the story, that desiring those kinds of things is not good for God's people. So then we get at the first verse of chapter 3. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. Now, this is one of Escher's drawings, and I put this up first because he's one of the very few artists that has the serpent with legs. Because the fall hasn't happened yet, and of course, as we know, God curses the serpent and then loses his legs. So in Escher's drawing of the temptation, the serpent has legs. Isn't that interesting? And can you see it? I mean, it's his typical way of drawing things. But the serpent is an interesting kind of motif in this mythological way of talking about the way the world is put together. In that throughout the ancient world, the snake was kind of held in awe, if you will. One, by the shape of the snake sort of had this phallic kind of identification. And so there seemed to be this idea that the snake represented fertility. And that the snake held the knowledge of fertility, how fertility happens. And there's also this idea that the snake was sort of associated with life and rejuvenation, because the snake had the ability to lose its skin and kind of start over, if you will. So the snake in ancient cultures was kind of revered and was always considered to be smart. And so even in Jay's story, the serpent is crafty. Now, I just want another caveat. In no place in this story is Satan identified as the snake. Satan is something that's added to the story many centuries later on. But in Jay's story, it's just the snake. And in some ways, the snake or the serpent is the one who possesses and guards the tree, but also then is the one who possesses this knowledge. And so part of the idea that Jay seems to be concerned about is the desire towards the knowledge of how fertility happens, having inside knowledge, if you will. And so again, by catering to the Canaanite gods, Baal and Ashtaroth and others, that they would gain knowledge about how life happens, and how to prevent women from being barren, and how to get rain to fall from the heavens and crops to grow and all that kind of stuff. Jay's concern is that, remember, it only comes from God. Fertility only comes from God and not from the other thing. So the snake kind of represents obviously the temptation towards knowledge and power that Jay is concerned about. A couple of other artist renditions of the snake, of the serpent. Ironically, in both of these, the head of the snake is a woman. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. We've had issues with this over the centuries, haven't we? And of course, that we could really get it. The whole idea that it's Eve's fault then becomes a big issue. And again, ironically, it isn't until after the fall that Eve is actually named. And that Eve is named in the second chapter. Eve is actually named after they've been run out of Eden, and Adam calls her Eve, the mother of all humankind, kind of thing. So, but this idea that Eve is responsible for the fall is not part of the original story. Yes, there is this. The Satan tempted her first, and then she suggested to Adam, and then they both. But the curses that follow this are equally distributed, you will. My take on why the church over time made women held women in such disdain is that they allowed the story of Prometheus and Pandora from Greek mythology to enter into their theology. And if you remember, Pandora is after Prometheus steals the fire and gives it to humankind, and in some ways that's considered a gift to humankind, and of course, but Prometheus is punished by the gods for having done that. And one of the ways that the gods punish is by sending Pandora to the earth, and she opens up her box of plagues. And so Pandora becomes the epitome of what's wrong with the world, and of course she's a woman. And unfortunately, church theology kind of brought that kind of idea about women, the Greek mythology, into its theology about women and what happened there in the garden. So that's a whole other series all by itself. But the temptation there, is that if we eat of this tree of knowledge, we will have knowledge. We will have knowledge about how fertility works and how everything, how the world works. And that's a good thing, isn't it? I always thought it was interesting how the artist could plant these trees in just the right places. Isn't that anyway? And of course, because of that, and in our story we have God saying, who told you that you were naked? Well, first, God goes walking in the garden and is looking for Adam and Eve, and they're hiding. And they're hiding because they're naked, and then God says, "Who told you that you were naked?" And then they talk. We ate of the tree, and Adam blames Eve, and of course, and so they're kicked out of the garden. This is Michelangelo's rendition. This is Cézanne's rendition of them being ousted from the garden. Isn't that's painful, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So the artists have found a way to capture this over the years. But as God finds out that they've eaten of the tree, there are these curses that then are delineated in our chapter 3 then. And in some way or other, they are all connected to fertility, to the snake. Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. So, a couple things about this. One, the snake, the symbol of fertility, is cursed to crawl along on the dust and eat the dust of the ground because it lots its legs. And so that's the curse for the snake. But there's this last sentence is a very interesting and intriguing sentence. In Christian theology, this kind of developed as a prophecy of the coming of Christ. But in Genesis, and of course Jewish scholars would never have would recognize that as a prophecy of Christ. But most scholars would say that what Jay is referring to here in this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, I mean between your offspring and hers, he will strike your head and you will strike his heel. Most scholars believe that the idea here is that whereas when the children of Israel go into the promised land and conquer the land and defeat the Canaanites, he will strike your head, defeats the Canaanites, but the Canaanite religion lives on and will continue to be a temptation and a problem for Israel throughout its history. And so the Canaanite gods are always striking back at the heel or at the descendants of Adam and Eve, in this case being the children of Israel. So that's where a lot of scholars believe that this line, he will strike your head and you will strike his heel, is that the Canaanites get defeated by the Israel when Joshua brings them over the Jordan River, but that the Canaanite religion continues to be a thorn in the side of Israel, or in this case, their heel. So that's kind of one of the ways that's thought about. And of course, then the next curse is, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, and yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Duh. Yeah, unfortunately, that seems to be but now, what would have happened? Would have childbirth have been not painful before? you don't go there. You can't, there's no way to figure that out. It's just part of the way that we tell this, that Jay tells the story, is that, in some ways, the descriptions that a myth has do seem to have observations about the way things are. You know, snakes don't have legs, and yes, women do experience considerable pain in childbearing. So it does describe the way things are, but it's not a scientific explanation. Just be careful about that. But that's one of the curse on the woman, and then the curse on the man is, because you listen to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So for the man, the curse seems to be is that you're going to have to work and work and work to make a living, to make it in life. Because the ground is going to be cursed, it's not going to be fruitful, and it's not going to be Garden of Eden. You're going to have to work really hard to make life happen and to survive. And so the ground is rendered barren. The ground is rendered not necessarily infertile, but it's going to be really, really hard. So all of these curses, the symbol of fertility, the snake gets cursed. The woman in childbearing experiences pain, and man is going to have to toil all the days of his life to make it. I didn't include the whole picture, but just to the right of Adam, and of course Eve is sitting there, and of course he's complaining to God that it's all her fault. So they are kicked out of the garden. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim, and a sword flaming, and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. Aha! Because part of the concern was that now that they've have this knowledge of how fertility happens, and the aspiring to the gods of Baal and Ashtaroth, this is from Jay's perspective, now they're going to want immortality, and we can't let that happen. So the way the story works is that they have to be kept from eating of the tree of life that will give them immortality. Another interesting thing that comes up in lots of ancient myths about the origins of the world is this idea of cherubim or angels or other spiritual beings that guard things that'll keep humans from gaining access to. And so the idea of the cherubim guarding the entrance to Eden actually is a theme that shows up in lots of other different creation stories, or stories about why it is that we are a fallen people. Let me stop here for a second and just mention, but we can't get into it in depth, but just to mention the whole idea of original sin. Yes, original sin has been around in Christian theology for a long, long time. And the idea is that when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that humankind was fallen and was out of God's grace and was utterly evil, depraved. All kinds of words have been put in, and that it actually came through through sexual, it was carried on from generation to generation, and that original fall was affected all of humanity, and that idea has been with us for a long time. I consider it to be an unfortunate view of theology, in that I don't think that the idea of the original sin has been a good theology. And what's interesting is that Jewish scholars, when they read Genesis, they don't see original sin whatsoever. It's